Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're pulling back the heavy velvet curtains on a world of glittering crowns and unspeakable medical horrors. Imagine a time when a simple headache could earn you a trip to a doctor with a knife, and the most common royal treatment for a fever was, well, letting the fever win the battle for your very essence, one drop of blood at a time. The air is thick with the scent of old leather, antiseptic herbs, and a faint coppery tang you probably won't survive. This isn't a fairy tale, it's a medical horror show featuring Europe's most powerful people. The very people who held the fate of nations in their hands were, in a very real sense, at the mercy of physicians whose entire knowledge base was built on little more than ancient superstition and a deep, abiding faith in the body's ability to bleed itself into submission. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening in from somewhere far-flung, let me know your location and the local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a member of the royal court standing in the cold, cavernous silence of a king's bedchamber. The heavy drapes are drawn, and the only light comes from a few flickering candles that cast long, dancing shadows on the ornate walls. In the centre of the room, on a bed so grand it seems more a throne than a place of rest, lies your monarch. His skin is flushed, his breath is ragged, and a fever has gripped him with an almost tangible force. The royal physician, a man whose reputation is as vast as his lack of actual medical knowledge, approaches the bed. He doesn't bring a pill or a soothing compress. Instead, he brandishes a small glittering lancet, a short blade designed for one single-minded purpose. This is bloodletting, the cornerstone of royal medicine, and tonight you're about to witness it firsthand. The theory behind it, rooted in the ancient Greek principles of Hippocrates and Galen, was absurdly simple. The human body, it was believed, contained 4 humours: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. For a person to be healthy, these 4 humours had to be in perfect balance. An illness, therefore, was merely a sign of an imbalance, a surplus of one humour that needed to be expelled. And since blood was the easiest to get at, it was always the first to go. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine scientific belief, or simply the result of a system where doctors couldn't admit they had no idea what to do, but it was the undisputed king of treatments for well over a millennium. Think about it. You've got a king who's sick with a fever. What's the logical course of action in the mind of a 17th century physician? Clearly his body has too much hot, fiery blood. The solution? Let some of it out. The physician would find a vein, often in the arm or neck, and make a small incision. Then a bowl would be placed to catch the crimson flow, sometimes meticulously weighed to ensure the correct amount was removed. It was a macabre ritual, one that you'd think would have been quickly discarded, but it clung to life with the stubbornness of a bad hangover. The practice wasn't just for fevers, of course. It was used for everything from indigestion and gout to insanity and epilepsy. A prince with a migraine, a little bloodletting, a queen feeling melancholic, a little bloodletting. It was the royal cure-all, the one-size-fits-all solution for any and every malady. You might even find a royal physician prescribing a preventative bloodletting, just to keep the humours in check, like a macabre version of a daily multivitamin. Take, for example, King Charles II of England. In 1685, he suffered a sudden collapse. His physicians immediately assumed he had too much blood, because, what else could it be? Their treatment was a truly shocking display of medical ignorance. They bled him, not once, but several times, removing an astonishing amount of blood. The king was a weak, dying man, and they were, for all intents and purposes, draining the life from him. This mainstream historical fact is a testament to the sheer destructive power of a deeply held, yet utterly wrong, medical belief. His doctors were so committed to the idea of balancing his humours that they couldn't see the simple truth. Their patient was already in a state of extreme weakness, and was being made worse, not better, by their cure. But it wasn't just the big dramatic incidents. Royal doctors were surprisingly meticulous about their bleeding. A quirky tidbit is that they often used charts and diagrams based on the phases of the moon and the patient's zodiac sign to determine the best time to bleed them. The belief was that the celestial bodies influenced the flow of the humours, so you couldn't just bleed a royal whenever you felt like it. It had to be done under the right astrological conditions. So a royal physician might be looking at a star chart as intently as he was at his patient, trying to determine the most auspicious moment to drain a pint or two. Imagine a full-blown medical emergency, and the doctor is saying, "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but the moon is in an unfavourable position. We'll have to wait until dawn." You watch as the physician makes the incision. A dark, thick stream of blood flows into the bowl, and the smell fills the room, heavy and iron-rich. The king groans, his face now a ghostly pale. The doctor nods approvingly as if this is a sign of success. He has done his duty. He has restored the balance. But you, from your modern perspective, know better. You know that what he has done has only weakened the king, making him more susceptible to the very disease that ailed him. Bloodletting's endurance is one of the great mysteries of medical history. It was a practice that consistently failed to produce positive results, yet it persisted for centuries. Why? The simple answer is that it was a tangible act. In an age of invisible pathogens and unknown diseases, a doctor who stood by and did nothing was seen as incompetent. A doctor who bled his patient was seen as a man of action, a person who was doing something, however misguided. And for the rich and powerful, a man of action was a man to be trusted with their lives. So, as the king's chamber grows quiet once more, and the physician tidies his instruments with a sense of professional accomplishment, you're left with a cold realization. For centuries, a royal title wasn't a shield against medical ignorance, it was a front-row seat to it. And the most dangerous man in the kingdom wasn't an assassin with a poison-laced dagger, but a well-meaning physician with a sharp lancet and a bowl, ready to restore the delicate balance of the royal humours, one fatal drop at a time. The royal bedside was a stage, and the physician was both the star actor and, more often than not, the harbinger of a truly messy end. The show is far from over, though, and as the lights fade on this scene, remember that the bowl of blood you just saw is only the beginning. The bowl of dark blood has been removed, the physician's instruments are put away, and a false sense of calm has settled over the royal bedchamber. But don't get too comfortable. That lancet you just saw was just one tool in a surprisingly vast arsenal of methods to get that precious royal blood flowing out, and the next one is just as unsettling. We move from the surgical precision of the blade to a more organic solution. Forget the clean incision. We're about to get a little slimy. The king, still weak from the recent bloodletting, is now deemed to have a localized bad humour that needs to be drawn out more directly. The physician returns to the bedside, but this time he's not alone. He carries a jar, and in that jar a writhing, squirming mass of what look like miniature black sausages. These, you realise with a shudder, are leeches. The use of leeches for medicinal purposes, a practice known as hierodotherapy, dates back thousands of years. But in the royal courts of Europe it reached an almost artistic level of application. The belief was that while a general bloodletting was good for the overall balance of the humours, a localised issue, a swollen ankle, a persistent headache, a bout of gout, required a more targeted approach. Leeches were the perfect solution. They were, in the minds of the royal doctors, tiny, living syringes, programmed to seek out and extract the bad blood causing the problem. You might find a physician carefully placing several leeches on a king's forehead to relieve a headache, or on a queen's swollen knee to draw out the inflammation. It's a wonderfully absurd thought. The most powerful people in the world, covered in tiny blood-sucking worms, all in the name of health. The process itself was a spectacle. The physician would select the fattest, most promising leeches from his jar. He might even prepare the skin first with a bit of sugar or milk to entice the leeches to attach more quickly. Then, he would place them on the designated spot. For a few moments, nothing would happen. Then, one by one, the leeches would latch on, their bodies swelling and elongating as they gorged themselves. This mainstream historical fact was considered a gentle and effective alternative to the more brutal surgical bloodletting. The leech, you see, was thought to be a more discerning doctor. It would only take what it needed and would not over-extract, unlike an overzealous physician. Of course, this was pure fantasy. Leeches simply feed until they are full, and if you've got a royal patient who is already weakened, a few greedy leeches could do just as much harm as a lancet. Consider the case of King Henry VIII. The big man was a walking medical mystery, and his physicians tried everything to cure his various ailments, including a leg ulcer that never seemed to heal. While we don't have a record of every single treatment, it's a near certainty that leeches were applied to this festering wound. The idea would have been to draw out the corrupt blood and pus, thereby allowing the ulcer to heal. The problem, of course, is that leeches don't differentiate between good and bad blood, and their bite can introduce bacteria, making a bad situation even worse. A quirky tidbit is that the demand for leeches in the 19th century was so high that they were farmed on a massive scale. Leeches became a commodity, their price fluctuating with the health of the royal courts and the aristocracy. Special leech gatherers, often women and children, would wade into swamps and ponds, allowing the leeches to attach to their legs so they could be harvested. It was a slimy and rather gruesome job, but it was essential to the prevailing medical wisdom of the day. But leeches weren't the only localized method for drawing blood. The physician now pulls out a second set of tools, a set of small glass cups and a spirit lamp. This, you realise, is the practice of cupping. There are two types, dry and wet. The king's doctor, never one to shy away from a little blood, is preparing for the wet variety. He lights the lamp and quickly heats the inside of one of the glass cups, creating a vacuum. He then places the hot cup on the king's skin. The sudden suction pulls the skin and subcutaneous tissue up into the cup. It's a jarring sight, the monarch's pale flesh turning red and swelling inside the glass. The purpose of this first step, the dry cupping, is to draw the blood to the surface. It's a preliminary manoeuvre, a setup for the grand finale. Once the cups have been applied and the skin is sufficiently reddened, the physician removes them, leaving behind large circular bruises. Then, with a quick and practised hand, he makes a series of tiny incisions on the now raised and sensitive skin. He quickly reapplies the cups, and this time the vacuum created by the heat pulls the blood out of the cuts and into the cup. It's a more controlled form of bloodletting than a lancet, but it looks just as gruesome. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of cupping were psychosomatic, or if there was a real, albeit ununderstood, physiological effect. Some modern medical researchers have suggested that cupping might have a mild analgesic effect or promote blood flow, but the idea that it was drawing out bad humours is, of course, pure nonsense. Yet, for a king or queen in pain, the sight of a doctor actively doing something, however strange, was often enough to inspire a little hope. Plus, the distinctive circular marks left by the cups were a badge of honour, a visible sign that one had been treated by a prestigious physician. You watch as the cups fill with blood. The king groans, but he doesn't protest. To him, this is the price of health, a necessary ritual. The royal physician, with a satisfied look on his face, removes the cups when they are full. He examines the contents, perhaps even sniffing the blood, as if its scent could tell him something about the king's condition. This kind of hands-on, deeply sensory and completely unscientific diagnosis was a core part of the royal medical experience. It was about showmanship as much as it was about medicine. The royal patient, already weakened by the lancet, is now even more drained. You might wonder how anyone survived this kind of treatment, and the truth is, many didn't. The irony of it all is that the very people who were at the pinnacle of power and wealth were often subjected to the most dangerous and absurd medical practices. They could afford the best physicians, and the best physicians of the time were often the most committed to these outlandish theories. A commoner might have been left to recover on his own, and in many cases this would have been the healthier option. But a king had to be treated, and the more elaborate the treatment, the more convinced everyone was that it was working. So, as the physician packs away his cups and his wriggling jar of leeches, you're left with a fresh understanding of the royal patient's predicament. They were not just sick, they were also a canvas for the most bizarre and often dangerous medical theories of their day. The king's body was a battlefield, and the doctors were the generals, fighting a war against invisible forces with weapons that were more likely to cause casualties than to win the battle. The leeches and cups, in their own way, were just as much a symbol of power as the crown itself, proof that a monarch could command not just an army, but the very fluids within their own body, or at least that they could pay someone a fortune to try. We have now moved past the simple lancet and into the realm of the truly bizarre, but believe me, we are just getting started. The next royal cure is even stranger and more deeply entwined with the very idea of kingship itself. The leeches and cupping instruments have been put away, and the royal bedchamber is now a little more peaceful, though the faint smell of blood still lingers. The king, however, is not the only patient on the mind of the royal physician. The ailments of the common people, though they might not warrant the same elaborate treatments, were also a source of great concern, particularly when they touched upon the very idea of kingship itself. We're now going to step outside the intimate, suffocating world of the bedchamber and into a much larger, more public arena, where a different kind of cure was administered, not by a doctor with a lancet, but by a monarch with a touch. This is the bizarre, deeply symbolic and utterly unscientific practice known as the King's Evil. The King's Evil, or scrofula, was a particularly nasty form of tuberculosis that caused painful, grotesque swellings of the lymph nodes, especially in the neck. For a commoner, it was a disease of poverty and poor sanitation, a chronic condition that could last for years. But for a king, it was an opportunity to demonstrate his divine right to rule. The belief, which originated in the Middle Ages and persisted well into the 18th century, was that a monarch, anointed by God, possessed a miraculous healing power in their touch. This power was thought to be a direct link to the heavens, a divine spark that could cleanse the body of its ails. You might think this sounds like a children's story, but it was a serious, deeply ingrained part of the political and medical landscape of Europe. Imagine you are a poor peasant, your neck swollen and weeping from scrofula. You have no money for doctors and no hope for a cure. Your only recourse is to travel to the nearest royal court, where you will join a long queue of other sufferers, all of you waiting for a moment with the monarch. This mainstream historical fact was a huge public event. Kings and queens would hold special ceremonies, sometimes weekly, where they would touch their subjects to heal them. It was a grand spectacle, a PR event of the highest order. The monarch would be dressed in their finest robes, and the ceremony would be accompanied by a religious service, often with a chaplain present. The atmosphere was a mix of religious reverence and desperate hope. The ritual was simple. The monarch would approach each person one by one. They would gently touch the affected area, the swollen neck, the weeping sores, and utter a short prayer or phrase. In England, the common phrase was, "I touch you, but God heals you." This was a clever bit of theological manoeuvring. If the person was cured, it was a miracle performed by God through the king. If they weren't, well, that was just God's will. The monarch also typically presented the patient with a small gold coin, a touch piece to be worn as a charm. This quirky tidbit served two purposes. It was a physical reminder of the king's power, and it also provided a little financial relief for the patient, which, let's be honest, might have been more helpful than the touch itself. The practice wasn't just limited to England and France. The two most famous practitioners, other monarchs, including the Holy Roman Emperor, also claimed to have the power of the touch. But the English and French examples are the most well documented, and they illustrate the bizarre intersection of power, faith and medicine. For the monarchs, it was a way to legitimize their rule. In a world of political upheaval and dynastic rivalries, claiming a direct, tangible link to the divine was a powerful tool. It set them apart from common nobles and rival claimants to the throne. You, as a citizen of the realm, would witness this and think, "My king is truly special. He is a servant of God." The medical establishment, of course, had to deal with this. Royal physicians, who were busy prescribing bloodletting and purges, couldn't openly question the monarch's divine power, so they worked with it, incorporating the king's touch into their own theories. They might advise a patient to seek the king's touch in addition to their regular treatments, or they might even attribute a successful cure to the touch, regardless of what they had done themselves. Historians still argue whether royal doctors privately believed in the power of the touch, or if they were simply playing along to stay in favour with the crown. It's a fascinating question. Were they true believers, or were they cynical opportunists? The answer is probably a bit of both. The practice reached its peak in the late 17th century. King Charles II of England, for example, was a prolific toucher. It's estimated that he touched over 92,000 people during his reign. The ceremony became so popular that it had to be carefully managed to prevent a stampede. Imagine the logistics. Thousands of people, all with suppurating sores and desperate hope, all vying for a moment with the king. It was a logistical nightmare and a public health crisis all in one, as diseases were easily spread among the waiting crowds. And yet the spectacle of it was a powerful unifying force. The king's touch wasn't just a medical treatment, it was a political sacrament. The practice finally began to fade in the 18th century, as the Age of Enlightenment and the rise of more scientific thinking made such rituals seem increasingly superstitious. Queen Anne was the last English monarch to perform the ceremony regularly. After her, the Hanoverian kings, who were more German and Protestant, saw the practice as a Catholic superstition and largely discontinued it. In France, the practice was revived briefly by Louis XVI but died out with the French Revolution. The idea of a monarch with miraculous healing powers was a relic of a bygone era, a world of divine right and ancient unscientific beliefs. You watch as the last of the sufferers shuffles away clutching their gold coin. The monarch, tired but triumphant, retreats from the public eye. What you have just witnessed is a powerful reminder that in the royal world, medicine and politics were inextricably linked. The king's touch was a medical treatment that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with power. It was a public performance designed to reinforce the very idea of kingship. The king might have been at the mercy of his own physicians, but he was also a physician himself, a healer of the masses. The irony is that while his own doctors were harming him with their bizarre treatments, he was offering a different kind of healing to his subjects, a healing that was based not on science but on faith, hope, and the sheer power of an idea. The royal physician, standing in the shadows, watched all of this. He knew that his lancet and his leeches were just a part of the royal medical world. The other part was something far more mystical, something he couldn't measure or weigh. He was a practitioner of a crude science, but the king was a practitioner of a divine art. And for all the harm he might have done to the king's body, he knew that the king's touch, even if it did nothing for the body, was a powerful balm for the spirit of his people. The contrast between these two worlds, the empirical and the mystical, is at the heart of royal medicine, and we're just about to see what happens when the two collide in a truly spectacular fashion. The last trace of the king's touch has faded, and we're back in the oppressive intimacy of a royal bedchamber. But this isn't the court of a medieval monarch. The year is 1788. The monarch is King George III of Great Britain, and the medical world, while still steeped in ancient superstition, has also begun to embrace new, and often even more horrifying, forms of treatment. The king is suffering from what his doctors call a bout of madness, a condition that today is believed to be a symptom of porphyria, a genetic blood disorder. But in the 18th century, a mental illness was a sign of a disordered mind, and a disordered mind needed to be brought back into line with the same kind of brutal physical methods used to correct a disordered body. You, as a member of the court, are about to witness a scene of such utter desperation and cruelty that it will make the bloodletting of earlier centuries seem almost quaint. King George III, a man known for his personal piety and devotion to his family, is no longer the composed monarch you know. He rants, he raves, he speaks nonsense, and he suffers from convulsions. He is, to the men of his time, a king possessed. The royal physicians, led by the utterly incompetent but highly respected Dr. Francis Willis, are called in. Doctor. Willis is not just a physician. He's also a clergyman who runs a private asylum, and his methods are, to put it mildly, unorthodox. His approach to mental illness is based on a concept of moral management, which essentially means beating the patient into submission. You probably can't imagine this, but a king, the most powerful man in the kingdom, is about to become a patient in what is effectively a private lunatic asylum. The first order of business, of course, is a liberal dose of bloodletting. The physicians bleed the king multiple times, convinced that his mania is a result of an excess of blood rushing to his brain. But this mainstream historical fact is only the beginning. Dr. Willis believes that the king's madness is a sign of a weakened will, and he intends to break that will and rebuild it. To do this, he employs a series of truly barbaric treatments. First, there are the purges. Doctor. Willis administers massive doses of purgatives, substances designed to induce violent vomiting and diarrhea. The belief is that the king's madness is caused by a build-up of toxins in his body, and the only way to get them out is through a system-wide cleanse. A quirky tidbit is that Willis would often use a combination of different purgatives, including antimonials, which were antimony-based compounds that could cause violent and sometimes fatal reactions. The king would be in a state of constant, agonizing physical distress, which Dr. Willis considered to be a sign of progress. The more the king suffered physically, the more he was being cleansed of his mental impurities. It's a truly chilling thought that a doctor would intentionally inflict physical pain on a patient to cure their mental anguish, but the physical torture doesn't stop there. Doctor. Willis believes that a key part of his treatment is to humiliate the king, to strip him of his royal dignity and force him to submit to his doctors. The king is no longer treated with respect. He is bound in a straitjacket, sometimes for hours on end, to prevent him from moving or lashing out. He's subjected to repeated cold baths, plunged into icy water to shock his system back to normal. He's even subjected to restraints, including a device that looks like a padded chair with straps to hold him down during his fits. The entire experience is a systematic dismantling of his dignity, all in the name of a cure. You watch as a team of attendants, under the watchful eye of Dr. Willis, force the king into a chair. He struggles, but he is no match for their combined strength. He is strapped in, and a gag is placed in his mouth to prevent him from biting his tongue. He is now, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner in his own palace. The silence in the room is broken only by his muffled cries and the shuffling of feet. This is the reality of royal medicine in the 18th century. Power and privilege were no protection against a doctor who believed he was doing God's work. Dr. Willis's methods were so extreme that they were a point of scandal even at the time. Parliament launched an investigation into the king's health and the treatments he was receiving. The physicians were forced to testify, and their accounts of the king's treatment were a shocking revelation to the public. The debate was not just about the king's health, but about the very nature of mental illness and the appropriate way to treat it. Historians still argue whether Dr. Willis's methods had any positive effect on the king's recovery. Some believe that the sheer force of his personality and the strict regimen he imposed might have been helpful to the king, who was a man of routine and order. Others argue that the king recovered despite the treatment, not because of it, and that the brutal methods simply prolonged his suffering. The final element of this horrifying treatment was the application of blisters. The physician would apply a topical preparation that would cause the skin to blister, sometimes over a large area. The blisters would then be lanced, and the fluid would be allowed to drain. The theory was that this would draw the bad humours away from the brain and into the skin. You can imagine the pain this would have caused, a searing, burning sensation followed by a slow, agonising healing process. The king's body was a map of his doctor's beliefs, a landscape of cuts, bruises and blisters, all in the name of a cure that was never guaranteed. Eventually the king did recover, at least for a time. His sanity returned, and he resumed his duties as monarch. Dr. Willis was hailed as a hero, and he received a grant of money and a reputation as a miracle worker. But his methods, while celebrated at the time, are today seen as a dark stain on the history of medicine. The treatments inflicted on King George III were a product of an age that saw mental illness not as a medical condition, but as a moral failing, a weakness of character that needed to be punished and subdued. The king's body was a battleground, and the doctors were the ones doing the fighting with the king as the ultimate casualty. So, as you leave the chilling tableau of the king's bedchamber, you're left with a profound sense of unease. The grand palaces and glittering crowns were a flimsy shield against the brutal reality of a medical system that was often more dangerous than the diseases it sought to cure. King George III's story is a powerful reminder that even the most powerful people in the world were utterly helpless in the face of medical ignorance. His reign, which saw the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, was also a personal odyssey of pain and suffering at the hands of those who were supposed to heal him. He was a king who ruled an empire, but in the end his body was not his own, but a laboratory for the bizarre and brutal experiments of his physicians. And this, believe it or not, is just the beginning of the horrors we have to explore. The next treatment involves a king's obsession with cleansing the body, and it's just as unpleasant as you might imagine. The memory of King George III's brutal treatment lingers like a bad taste in your mouth. A stark reminder that royal medicine was often about control and punishment as much as it was about healing. But the story of royal physicians' bizarre interventions is far from over. We're about to move from the mind to the gut. We're going to a place where medical belief was fixated on a single universal solution for any ailment: getting things moving. Get ready to explore the glorious and often violent history of royal laxatives and purging regimens. The belief was that the body was a sewer, and a sick body was a sewer that had become clogged. The only cure was a good, thorough flush. Imagine you're in the palace of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, a man of such immense power and vanity that he thought of himself as the centre of the universe. Yet, even he was subject to the whims of his physicians, and his personal health regimen was a testament to the era's obsession with internal cleanliness. This mainstream historical fact is a defining element of his reign. Louis XIV was an enthusiastic participant in his own purgations. He was prescribed a daily or near-daily regimen of laxatives, often in the form of enemas, which were prepared and administered with a kind of ritualistic solemnity. The king would often receive his courtiers while on his commode, a chamber pot disguised as a lavish chair. It was a bizarre mingling of the most public and most private moments of a king's life. The sheer amount of time and effort dedicated to this daily ritual speaks volumes about how central this practice was to royal health. The philosophy behind this was, again, rooted in the idea of the four humours. An imbalance, especially an excess of black or yellow bile, was thought to cause all manner of illness. The body's natural way of expelling these excess humours was through vomiting or defecation. Therefore, if you were sick, it was because your body was failing to do its job properly. The physician's role was simply to give it a little encouragement. This encouragement came in many forms. There were purgatives made from herbs, from minerals, and from a dizzying array of other substances, many of which were toxic in large doses. A quirky tidbit is the use of the powerful laxative hellebore. This plant, which is highly poisonous, was a favourite among royal physicians. The physician would carefully measure out a dose, often mixed with other herbs, and give it to the king. The hellebore would induce not just diarrhoea, but often violent vomiting as well. The patient would be in a state of utter misery, but the physician would be watching with a sense of triumph. For every retch and every bout of watery stool, he would be convinced that the body was being purified, that the offending humours were being expelled, and that a cure was on its way. The sheer violence of the reaction was considered a sign of the treatment's effectiveness. The more a royal patient was suffering, the more they were being healed. It's a beautifully twisted bit of logic that makes no sense to us today, but was the cornerstone of medical belief for centuries. The obsession with laxatives was not just a response to illness, it was a form of preventative care. Royal physicians would prescribe regular purges to their healthy patients, convinced that it was the best way to maintain the delicate balance of the humours. A king might be subjected to a purge once a week, or even more frequently, just to ensure that his body was operating at peak efficiency. This was the equivalent of a modern-day cleanse, but instead of green juice, you're getting a dose of a plant that could kill you. The royal family's daily life was a cycle of eating, being purged, eating again, and being purged again. It's a wonder they had the time to rule an empire. The physicians themselves were masters of this dark art. They would prepare their concoctions with a sense of meticulous care, often using special recipes passed down through generations of royal doctors. They would watch their royal patients with a hawk's eye, monitoring the consistency and colour of the king's or queen's stool to determine the effectiveness of the treatment. This was a form of diagnosis, a way of reading the body's internal state. You might hear a physician announce with great satisfaction that the king's stool was now the right shade of yellow, a sign that the liver was functioning properly and the humours were in balance. It's a grotesque image, but it was a serious part of the royal medical experience. Historians still argue whether the royal patients themselves believed in the efficacy of these treatments, or if they were simply resigned to them. It's hard to imagine a powerful monarch like Louis XIV willingly subjecting himself to such daily torment. Was it a sign of his complete trust in his physicians? Or was it a reflection of an age where people were so desperate for a cure that they would try anything, no matter how unpleasant? The truth is probably a mixture of both. The king had been raised in a world where this was the only kind of medicine there was. To question it would be to question the very fabric of his world. Plus, the doctors were, for all their faults, incredibly convincing. They were men of learning and authority, and their prescriptions were delivered with a sense of utter confidence. The purges were also a symbol of control. In an age where a king's life was constantly at risk from rivals and disease, a king who could control his own body was a king who could control his kingdom. The ability to endure such a brutal regimen was a sign of a strong will, a will that was capable of governing a nation. The king's chamber was not just a place of healing, it was a stage for a performance of power and resilience. The king, even in his moments of physical weakness, was still a king. He was still the Sun King. As you step away from the scene of Louis XIV on his commode, you're left with a profound sense of the royal body as a battlefield. The doctors were not just fighting disease, they were fighting a kind of philosophical war, a war against the idea of a body that was not in perfect harmonious balance. The laxatives and purges were their main weapons, and they used them with an almost religious fervour. The royal family, for all their splendour, were in a very real sense captives of a medical system that was more interested in the idea of a perfect body than the reality of a healthy one. The next treatment we're going to explore takes this absurdity to a whole new level. It involves a very strange, very old and very dead medicine that was believed to have magical properties. Prepare yourself, because we're about to get a little dusty. The stench of purging concoctions and the memory of Louis XIV's commode are still fresh, but we're now moving into a realm that's less about internal cleansing and more about, well, external decomposition. We're going to step into a part of royal medicine so bizarre and unsettling it feels like something out of a pulp horror novel. The year is the 16th century, the place is a royal apothecary's workshop, and the key ingredient in today's remedy is something you would never in a million years expect. It's not a herb or a mineral or a purging plant, it's a mummy. A real, bona fide, desiccated human mummy, powdered down and ready for consumption. You might be shaking your head in disbelief, but this mainstream historical fact is an astonishing reality of royal medicine. The practice, known as mumia, involved the use of ground-up human remains as a cure for a wide range of ailments. It was believed to have a mystical, almost supernatural power. The origins of the practice are a fascinating bit of twisted logic. Ancient physicians believed that a substance called mumia, a kind of naturally occurring bitumen found in the mountains, had powerful healing properties, but as the supply of this substance ran out, enterprising merchants began to substitute something that looked similar: the dark, tar-like residue found inside Egyptian mummies. The two substances became conflated, and over time the word mummy itself came to be seen as a powerful medicine. Royal physicians, always on the lookout for the most exotic and powerful remedies, were among the first to embrace this practice. The logic was simple: if a mummy had survived for thousands of years, it must contain a kind of life-preserving essence. By ingesting this essence, a patient could transfer that same immortality and strength to their own body. It was a bizarre kind of sympathetic magic. A king suffering from a fever or a queen with a stubborn cough might be prescribed a small dose of powdered mummy mixed into a drink or a poultice. It was a status symbol too. The royal family could afford the most expensive and exotic ingredients, and nothing was more exotic than a relic from a civilization that had died out thousands of years before. The process was as macabre as you can imagine. Mummies were imported from Egypt in great numbers. They were then ground into a fine powder, sometimes with a mortar and pestle, sometimes on a larger scale. The physicians would then mix this powder with other ingredients, like honey or wine, to make it more palatable. A quirky tidbit is that the demand for mummies became so high that a black market for them emerged. Grave robbers and charlatans began to sell fakes, using the bodies of recently deceased criminals and tramps, which were then dried and treated to resemble authentic mummies. This led to a strange problem for royal apothecaries: how to tell a real mummy from a fake. The solution was often to look for the authenticating signs of age, like the presence of bits of linen wrappings or the smell of ancient spices. The belief in the healing power of mummies was so widespread that it persisted for centuries. Even as late as the 18th century, powdered mummy was still available in some apothecaries, and it was still a part of the royal medical toolkit. For a royal patient, it was a treatment that conveyed a kind of ancient prestige. You weren't just taking medicine, you were participating in a ritual that connected you to the pharaohs and the gods of ancient Egypt. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder if anyone ever felt a little queasy about the whole thing. Did a king or queen ever look down at their cup of wine, see the dark, gritty powder swirling at the bottom, and wonder just what, or who, they were about to consume? The practice of consuming human remains wasn't just limited to mummies. Another bizarre variant was the use of moss from human skulls, a kind of lichen that grew on bones left out in the open. This was believed to be a powerful cure for epilepsy. The body, in all its forms, was seen as a source of medicine. The human was the ultimate sympathetic magic. By consuming a part of another human, you could absorb their life force, their power, their essence. It's a beautifully grotesque and deeply superstitious belief that existed side by side with more scientific practices like bloodletting and purging. Historians still argue whether the physicians who prescribed this stuff actually believed in its efficacy, or if they were simply pandering to the superstitions of their powerful patients. It's a tough call. On the one hand, a physician who wanted to stay in favour with a king couldn't tell him that his favourite remedy was a fraud. On the other hand, the belief in sympathetic magic was so widespread that it's entirely possible that they genuinely thought it worked. The medical world was a strange place, where a man could be a master of botany and anatomy, and still believe that a powdered mummy could cure a fever. It was a world where science and superstition were not enemies but bedfellows. You watch as the royal apothecary prepares a draught for the king, a small spoonful of dark powder from a jar with a faded ancient label. He mixes it with honey, making a thick dark paste that the king will have to swallow. The king, a man of power and wealth, is about to eat a part of a person who died thousands of years ago. The irony is staggering. He can command armies, build palaces, and shape the destiny of nations. But he is utterly at the mercy of a medical system that is just as likely to feed him a corpse as it is to heal him. The belief in mumia finally began to fade in the 18th century, as the Enlightenment brought a more critical eye to ancient remedies. Doctors like Andreas Vesalius, who dissected human bodies and advanced the study of anatomy, helped to chip away at the old superstitions, but it took centuries for the practice to completely die out. The idea that a body, even a dead one, could be a source of life was a powerful one, and it was not easily dismissed. As you step away from the apothecary's workshop, you're left with a sense of the sheer, unfathomable strangeness of royal medicine. It was a world where a lancet, a leech, a commode, and a powdered corpse were all part of the same medical toolkit. The royal body was not just a symbol of power, it was a canvas for the most bizarre and dangerous beliefs of its time. And we're about to explore a treatment that is even more terrifying, a surgical procedure so extreme and so ancient that it feels like it belongs in a different species' medical history entirely. It's the most literal kind of head-on approach to a problem, and it's coming up next. The taste of powdered mummy has faded, leaving a dry, metallic flavour in your mouth, a reminder of just how far royal physicians were willing to go. But now, we're going to move from consuming the dead to operating on the living, and not just any operation, but one of the most ancient and shocking surgical procedures in human history. We're going to talk about trepanation, the practice of drilling a hole in a person's skull. You might think this is something out of a prehistoric cave painting, but it was a very real and very horrifying part of the royal medical toolkit for centuries. The belief was that a hole in the skull could release evil spirits, or pressure from a diseased brain, or even just a particularly stubborn headache. For a king with a raging fever, or a queen with a mysterious neurological ailment, this was not a last resort. It was a serious and often prescribed course of action. Imagine you're in the bedchamber of a king, a man who's been plagued by fits and violent headaches for weeks. The royal physicians have tried everything: bloodletting, purges, even a dose of powdered mummy. Nothing has worked. The king, a man of immense power, is now at the mercy of a condition they cannot understand. The lead physician, a man with a steady hand and a chillingly calm demeanour, pulls out his tools. They are not a lancet or a syringe, but a set of sharp metal implements, a drill-like device with a circular cutting edge, a saw, and a scraper. This is a trepan, and what you're about to witness is a full-blown surgical procedure, performed with no anaesthesia and a complete lack of modern sterile practices. The mainstream historical fact is that trepanation was practiced on royalty and commoners alike for thousands of years, with evidence of its use found in ancient Egyptian, Greek and Roman societies, and continuing through the Middle Ages and Renaissance. It was one of the few surgical procedures of the time that was done with an actual curative intent, rather than simply for battlefield triage. The physician would begin by shaving the patient's head. He would then make an incision in the scalp to expose the skull. The patient, a monarch, would be awake and conscious, likely held down by several strong attendants. The pain must have been unimaginable. Then, the physician would take the trepan, the drill-like tool, and begin to turn it. The sound would have been a sickening crunch, a slow, grinding noise as the bone was sawed away. The goal was to remove a small circular piece of the skull, leaving a neat round hole. The physician would have to be incredibly careful not to go too deep and damage the delicate membrane of the brain. The whole process was a terrifying display of surgical skill and blind faith. Why would a physician do this? The reasons were a mix of the spiritual and the proto-scientific. A quirky tidbit is that for a long time the primary reason for trepanation was to release evil spirits. A headache, a mental illness, or even an epileptic fit was thought to be caused by a malevolent force trapped inside the skull. Drilling a hole was seen as a way to give that spirit an escape route. The piece of bone that was removed was often kept by the patient as a lucky charm, a physical reminder of the spirit that had been exorcised. Over time, the theory shifted from the supernatural to the physiological. Doctors began to believe that a headache was caused by an excess of blood or bad humours, putting pressure on the brain. The hole in the skull was a way to relieve that pressure, a kind of permanent bloodletting for the brain. It's an utterly fascinating and horrifying evolution of a single, incredibly dangerous practice. The physicians who performed this procedure were celebrated as masters of their craft. A successful trepanation was a sign of a surgeon's immense skill and courage, and for the royal patient, a survival of the procedure was seen as a testament to their own strength and the divine favour of God. The sight of a royal patient with a gaping hole in their skull, covered by a piece of metal or a plate, would have been a common, if unsettling, sight in the royal court. The patient, who had survived the procedure, would often be hailed as a kind of miracle. Historians still argue whether trepanation was ever truly effective. The evidence is mixed. On the one hand, a small hole in the skull could, in theory, relieve pressure from a brain hemorrhage or a fluid buildup. On the other hand, the procedure was incredibly dangerous. The risk of infection was astronomical, and a simple scratch from an unsterilised tool could lead to a fatal fever. The patient's survival was a matter of pure luck and a strong immune system. The majority of trepanned skulls found in archaeological digs show signs of healing, which means that the patient survived the initial procedure, but we have no way of knowing how many died from the subsequent infection. It's a medical question that can't be answered. Was it a cure or a death sentence? We'll never know for sure. You watch as the physician finishes his work. The piece of bone is removed, and a small bloody hole is left in the king's skull. The king, who was screaming and struggling moments ago, is now eerily still. The physician bandages the wound and the king is left to recover. The room, which was filled with a sense of frantic energy, is now quiet, and the only sound is the king's slow, ragged breathing. You can't help but wonder if he will survive the night. He is now, quite literally, a man with a hole in his head, and the only thing protecting his brain is a thin layer of skin and a piece of cloth. The use of trepanation on royals shows us something profound about the relationship between power and medicine. A king, who could have any doctor in the world, was still a captive of the most ancient and barbaric of medical beliefs. His wealth and status were no shield against a procedure that was more ritual than science. The hole in his skull was a physical manifestation of a physician's desperate attempt to cure a disease they couldn't understand. It was an act of brutal faith, a belief that a simple physical intervention could solve a complex medical problem. As we move on, remember the trepan. It's a symbol of the raw, violent nature of royal medicine. It's a reminder that even the most advanced societies are capable of believing in the most primitive of cures, and it's a warning that in the absence of knowledge, superstition will always rush in to fill the void. The royal physician, with his trepan, was not a monster. He was a man of his time, a man who believed that he was doing everything he could to save a king. And that, in its own way, is the most terrifying thing of all. The image of a king with a hole in his head is a difficult one to shake. A visceral reminder of a time when the line between medicine and brutal magical thinking was blurred to the point of being invisible. We are now going to delve even deeper into the world of magic, but this time it's a magic with a purpose far grander than curing a headache. We're going to talk about alchemy and the royal quest for the ultimate medicine, the Philosopher's Stone. This isn't a fairy tale you might have read in a dusty old book. For centuries, alchemy was considered a legitimate scientific pursuit, a mix of chemistry, metallurgy, and mystical philosophy. And for a king, who was already at the top of the food chain, the idea of a substance that could turn base metals into gold and, more importantly, create an elixir of eternal life was a powerful, irresistible temptation. Imagine you're in the private laboratory of Emperor Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man so obsessed with alchemy and the occult that he spent most of his life in seclusion, surrounded by alchemists, astrologers, and all manner of charlatans and geniuses. The room is a cluttered mess of beakers, retorts, furnaces, and strange-smelling powders. The air is thick with the fumes of burning sulphur and the metallic scent of heated mercury. Rudolph II was a passionate patron of the alchemical arts, and for him, the quest for the Philosopher's Stone was not just about wealth, but about power. He believed that with such an elixir, he could cure his own myriad health problems and extend his life indefinitely. This mainstream historical fact highlights the deep connection between royal power and the pursuit of mystical science. A king with the secret to eternal life would be more than just a king. He would be a god. The alchemists who flocked to Rudolf's court were not just fringe figures. They were men of great learning, often with knowledge of metallurgy and chemistry far beyond that of the average physician. They believed in a grand, overarching theory of the universe, a theory that held that all things were connected and could be transmuted from one form to another. The ultimate goal, the magnum opus, was the philosopher's stone, a substance that was said to be able to turn lead into gold and to create an elixir of life, a panacea for all human ailments. The royal physicians, who were busy prescribing leeches and purges, often found themselves in competition with these alchemists, who promised not just a cure for a disease, but a cure for death itself. The alchemist's work was shrouded in secrecy and filled with symbolic language. They would refer to their ingredients in code, using terms like the Red King for gold and the White Queen for silver. Their recipes were a mix of chemical procedures and mystical incantations. They would often use strange and dangerous ingredients like mercury, lead and arsenic, believing that these were the key to unlocking the secrets of the universe. For a royal patient, the alchemist's concoction was often just as likely to kill them as to cure them. A quirky tidbit is that many of the alchemist's most promising remedies were in fact highly toxic. They would often prepare elixirs containing mercury, which they believed had a kind of magical, life-giving property. Of course, what it actually did was cause severe neurological damage and a slow, agonizing death. The line between alchemy and medicine was incredibly thin. The alchemists were, in many ways, the first pharmacists. They were the ones who understood how to distill, ferment and combine substances. A royal physician, therefore, might find himself turning to an alchemist for a particularly difficult case. The alchemist might prepare a tincture of gold, or a distillation of a rare herb, or a mercury-based concoction, all of which would be sold to the king as a powerful, life-prolonging elixir. The irony, of course, is that the physician, who would refuse to use a scientific method that he didn't understand, was happy to hand his patient over to a man who was, in many ways, a complete unknown. Historians still argue whether the royal patrons of alchemy were true believers, or if they were simply captivated by the promise of easy wealth and a longer life. The case of Rudolf II is particularly telling. He spent a fortune on his alchemical pursuits, and his court was a magnet for every crackpot and visionary in Europe. He genuinely seemed to believe in the promise of the alchemical arts, and he saw them as a way to transcend the limitations of his own mortality. But his story is also a cautionary tale. He died a lonely and isolated man, his court in disarray, and his kingdom on the brink of collapse. The philosopher's stone, which he had spent his life searching for, remained a myth. The alchemist's failure to produce an elixir of life did not, however, mean that their work was without a lasting legacy. Many of the techniques they developed, distillation, sublimation, and fermentation, became the foundation of modern chemistry. The glassware they used, the methods they employed, and the very idea of experimentation itself were all a part of the alchemical tradition. So while they failed to create an elixir of eternal life, they laid the groundwork for a more scientific understanding of the world. You watch as the royal alchemist, a man with wild hair and a look of crazed intensity in his eyes, pours a strange, milky liquid into a small vial. He holds it up to the light, and it shimmers with a faint, otherworldly glow. This, he tells the king, is a tincture of gold, a powerful elixir that will restore his vigour and prolong his life. The king, a man who has been bled, purged and blistered, looks at the vial with a mixture of hope and scepticism. He takes it and drinks. You can't help but wonder if it's the last thing he will ever drink. The story of alchemy and the royal pursuit of the philosopher's stone is a powerful reminder that royal medicine was not just about treating disease. It was about controlling the very fabric of life and death. The king, as the ultimate authority, believed that he could command not just his subjects, but the forces of nature itself. He saw the alchemist not as a charlatan, but as a man who held the key to ultimate power. The royal laboratory, with its strange smells and bubbling concoctions, was not just a place of scientific inquiry. It was a sanctuary of hope, a place where a king could dream of transcending the limitations of his own mortality. It was a dream that would, for centuries, remain a beautiful but deadly illusion. The next section explores one of the most horrifying and toxic treatments of the royal era, and it shows just how far a royal physician would go to cure a disease that was considered a mark of sin. The lingering scent of alchemical fumes and the memory of kings pursuing an impossible elixir still hang in the air. But we're now moving into a realm where the magic is replaced by a different kind of horror, a poison. We're going to explore one of the most infamous and toxic treatments of the royal era, the use of mercury to cure syphilis. This wasn't a fringe theory or a desperate last resort. For centuries, mercury was the go-to treatment for a disease that was considered a mark of moral failure and divine punishment. And for a royal, who was at the very pinnacle of power and moral authority, being afflicted with a venereal disease was a source of immense shame. The cure, as it turned out, was often worse than the disease itself. Imagine you're in the private chambers of a royal, a prince perhaps, who has been diagnosed with the French pox, as syphilis was often called. The initial symptoms are painful sores, followed by a rash, and later a host of terrifying neurological and physical problems, from blindness and insanity to a slow, agonizing death. The royal physicians, with a grave look on their faces, prescribe the only known cure. They don't offer a soothing balm or a purifying herb. They offer a heavy, shimmering, silver-white metal, mercury. This mainstream historical fact is a testament to the lack of medical knowledge and the desperation of the time. The belief was that the mercury, a powerful and highly toxic substance, would fight fire with fire, driving the disease from the body with a violent and often fatal fury. The treatments were administered in a variety of truly horrifying ways. The most common method was topical application. The physician would rub mercury paste or ointment directly onto the patient's sores and skin. Another method was to have the patient sit in a hot room, often called a sweat box, where mercury fumes were released. The patient would inhale the toxic vapour, which was believed to penetrate deep into the body and attack the disease from within. A quirky tidbit is that royal patients were often given mercury in the form of a pill, which they would swallow. These pills, known as blue mass, were a mixture of mercury and other ingredients, and they were a staple of the royal apothecary for centuries. The idea was that the mercury would circulate through the bloodstream, seeking out and destroying the disease. The patient would become incredibly sick, with symptoms ranging from violent vomiting and diarrhea to the loss of teeth and hair, but the physicians considered this to be a sign that the treatment was working, that the mercury was purifying the body. The symptoms of mercury poisoning were often confused with the symptoms of syphilis itself. The neurological damage, the tremors, the delirium, and the physical decay were all seen as a part of the curing process. The royal patient, already weakened by the disease, would be subjected to a slow, agonizing poisoning. They would lose their teeth and gums, their breath would reek of a metallic odour, and their hands would shake uncontrollably. Their bodies would become a living testament to the destructive power of a medical belief system that was more about faith than science. The treatment was often more effective at killing the patient than curing the disease. Many royals who were treated with mercury for syphilis died not from the disease, but from the poisoning. The case of King Francis I of France is a classic example. While we don't know for sure that he was treated with mercury, it's a near certainty that he was given some form of it for his syphilis, and his death at a relatively young age was likely hastened by the toxic treatments. He was a man of immense power, but he was utterly helpless in the face of a medical system that was just as likely to kill him as to heal him. The use of mercury for syphilis was a powerful example of the do-something mentality of royal medicine. In an era where a disease like syphilis was a terrifying unknown, a doctor who stood by and did nothing was seen as incompetent. A doctor who prescribed a powerful, toxic substance and who could produce a tangible, if horrifying, result was seen as a man of action, a man to be trusted. The patient's suffering was a kind of proof, a sign that the medicine was working. It was a vicious cycle of belief and brutal physical reality. Historians still argue whether the physicians of the time were aware of the toxic effects of mercury. The answer is likely yes, but they saw the side effects as an unfortunate but necessary part of the cure. They believed that the mercury was so powerful that it was able to drive the disease from the body, and the patient's suffering was just a sign of the battle being waged. It was a kind of medical fatalism, a belief that a patient had to be made worse before they could get better. This was a dangerous and often deadly ideology, and it was one that was applied with a particular fervour to the most powerful and, therefore, most valuable patients in the kingdom. The practice of using mercury for syphilis eventually began to fade in the 19th century, with the discovery of antibiotics, but for centuries it was the only game in town. The royal family, with all its wealth and power, was a living laboratory for the bizarre and brutal medical experiments of the day. The prince with the French pox was not just a patient. He was a guinea pig, a symbol of a medical system that was willing to sacrifice a person's life in the pursuit of a cure. The mercury, in its own way, was a kind of alchemical mirror, a toxic substance that promised a cure but delivered a curse. You watch as the prince, his body racked with pain and his gums a sickly black, is led away from the sweatbox. He is a shell of the man he once was, his once dashing good looks replaced by the gaunt skeletal features of a man who is being slowly poisoned. His doctors, with a sense of grim satisfaction, note his progress in a ledger. They believe they are winning the war against the disease. You, with your knowledge of modern medicine, know that they are simply losing the battle for his life. The royal bedchamber was not a place of healing. It was a chamber of horrors, and the prince was just one more casualty in a long, brutal war against ignorance. And the next battle is about to begin. A battle fought with a surprising and often uncomfortable weapon. The prince's silent suffering from mercury poisoning is a grim testament to the dangers of royal medicine. But now we're moving from a terrifying treatment to a strangely routine one. We're going to step into the world of the royal enema, a practice so common and so central to the health of the royal family that it was a part of their daily routine. This wasn't a punishment or a last resort. For many centuries, the enema was seen as a way to maintain the delicate balance of the humours, to cleanse the body of impurities, and to ensure that a monarch was in peak condition. The belief was that the royal gut was the engine of the kingdom, and it had to be kept running smoothly. You'll be surprised at just how much a King's Day was centred around this particular ritual. Imagine you're a valet in the court of King Louis XIV of France, a man who, as we've already discussed, was obsessed with the idea of internal cleanliness. You wake him in the morning not with a bell or a servant's song, but with a specific ornate device, a large brass syringe known as a clyster. This mainstream historical fact is a defining element of the Sun King's reign. It is estimated that Louis XIV received over 2,000 enemas during his lifetime, an average of one per day. This was a morning ritual performed with the same regularity and pomp as his dressing or his public levee. The king would often receive courtiers while on his chamber pot, a strange blend of the most intimate and most public moments of a monarch's life. The enema was not a source of shame, it was a symbol of health and vitality. The logic behind this was simple and by the standards of the time quite sound. A body, it was believed, was like a vessel, and food and drink were constantly being put in. If nothing was taken out, the vessel would become clogged, and the waste would turn to a kind of poison. The enema, therefore, was a preventative measure, a way to ensure that the body's sewer was kept clear. The physicians believed that a blockage in the gut could lead to a host of other problems, from headaches and fevers to more serious illnesses. The enema was a way to keep the humours in balance, a kind of internal spring cleaning that was performed with a remarkable frequency. The recipes for the enemas were a source of great creativity and debate among physicians. A quirky tidbit is that they often contained a wide variety of ingredients, some of which were quite pleasant, and others that were less so. They might include rosewater, honey or wine to make them more palatable, but they might also include things like bitter herbs, soap, or even tobacco smoke, all of which were believed to have medicinal properties. The physician would carefully mix the ingredients in a large bowl, and then, using the clyster, would administer the liquid into the patient's rectum. The process was often a public spectacle, and a king's ability to endure it with dignity was a sign of his strength and resolve. It's hard to imagine, but for Louis XIV, this was a part of his job. He was a king who ruled an empire and a king who had to endure a daily and often public enema. The enema was a particularly popular treatment for a variety of ailments. A king with a fever might be given an enema to cool his body and to flush out the excess heat. A queen with a headache might be given one to relieve the pressure from her brain. A royal patient with indigestion would be given one to get things moving again. It was a one-size-fits-all solution, a universal panacea that was seen as a gentler alternative to the more violent purges we've already discussed. The enema was seen as a more direct and more efficient way to cleanse the body, as it bypassed the stomach and went straight to the source of the problem. Historians still argue whether the royal patients themselves believed in the efficacy of the enemas, or if they were simply resigned to them. For many, it was a part of the daily routine, a kind of health insurance that was administered by their physicians. The doctors, of course, were completely convinced. They believed that they were performing a vital service, a service that was just as important as prescribing a pill or lancing a boil. The royal body, in their eyes, was a delicate machine, and the enema was the oil that kept it running smoothly. The use of enemas was not just limited to the French court. It was a widespread practice throughout Europe, and it was embraced by royals and commoners alike. But the French court under Louis XIV was where it reached its zenith. The Sun King, who saw himself as a symbol of divine perfection, believed that his body had to be a perfect vessel, and the enema was the tool that made that possible. The king's body, in a very real sense, was a metaphor for his kingdom. A healthy body meant a healthy kingdom, and an unhealthy body meant a kingdom in decline. The enema, therefore, was not just a medical treatment, it was a political act. It was a way for the king to show his subjects that he was in control, that his body was a well-oiled machine, and that his kingdom was strong and prosperous. You watch as the valet, with a professional and practised hand, administers the enema to the king. The king, a man who has commanded armies and negotiated peace treaties, lies on his side, his face a mask of resignation. The room is quiet, the only sound the faint sloshing of the liquid as it is administered. It's a surreal scene, a powerful and poignant reminder that for all their wealth and power, the royals were still at the mercy of a medical system that was often more about ritual than science. The enema was a bizarre but defining aspect of their lives. It was a daily dose of humiliation and a daily dose of hope. It was a reminder that in the world of royal medicine, a king was not just a monarch, but also a patient who had to endure the indignity of a daily public enema. As you step away from the king's chamber, you can't help but think about the sheer absurdity of it all. The enema was a medical treatment that was based on a flawed understanding of the human body, but it was a treatment that was administered with the highest degree of professionalism and solemnity. It was a part of a king's life, a part of his day, and a part of his legacy. The next treatment we're going to explore is a little more recreational, but it was just as dangerous, and it was just as central to the lives of the royal family. Prepare to be soothed and perhaps a little sickened. The memory of the king's daily enema is a bizarre yet strangely mundane glimpse into the royal obsession with internal harmony. But now we're going to move from a treatment that was about cleansing to one that was about escaping. We're going to talk about opium and laudanum, and how these powerful narcotic substances became a staple of the royal medicine cabinet, a way to manage pain, soothe nerves, and induce a state of blissful, if temporary, oblivion. This wasn't a recreational indulgence, at least not at first. For centuries, opium was considered a legitimate medicine, and for a royal who was constantly under pressure, in pain, or suffering from a chronic ailment, it was a lifeline. You're about to see how a plant from a far-off land became a central part of a king's daily life, and how a medicine became a slow-acting poison. Imagine you're in the bedchamber of a queen who is suffering from a particularly vicious migraine. She has been bled, she has been purged, and she has been given every herbal remedy in the physician's arsenal, but nothing has worked. She's in agony, her head throbbing with a pain that is so intense it threatens to shatter her sanity. The royal physician, a man who has exhausted all of his other options, prepares a small glass vial. It contains a dark, syrupy liquid, a mixture of alcohol and opium. This is laudanum, and it is by far the most effective painkiller of its time. He gives it to the queen, and she drinks it down in a single gulp. Within minutes her face softens, the lines of pain disappear, and she slips into a peaceful, pain-free slumber. This mainstream historical fact is a testament to the power of opium. It was, for a long time, the only substance that could provide a truly effective relief from pain. For a royal, who could not afford to be seen in a state of weakness or agony, it was a godsend. The use of opium dates back to ancient times, but it became particularly popular in the royal courts of Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. The drug was often prescribed for a wide range of ailments, from chronic pain and insomnia to anxiety and depression. A king who was struggling to sleep might be given a dose of laudanum to calm his nerves. A queen who was suffering from the pain of a difficult childbirth might be given a dose to ease her suffering. The doctors saw it as a kind of miracle drug, a panacea that could fix anything. The royal family, with all its wealth and power, was able to afford the finest opium from the East, and it was a staple of their medicine cabinet. A quirky tidbit is that the use of opium was not just a medical treatment. It was also a kind of social ritual. In the 18th century, it was not uncommon for a royal to take a small dose of laudanum after dinner as a way to unwind and relax. It was seen as the equivalent of a modern-day nightcap, a way to end the day with a sense of calm and serenity. The royal court was a place of immense pressure, with constant political intrigue and social demands. Opium provided a kind of escape, a way to forget the stresses of the day and to slip into a world of blissful forgetfulness. It was a powerful and addictive habit, and it was one that was embraced by some of the most powerful people in the world. The problem, of course, was that opium was highly addictive. A royal patient who was given laudanum for a chronic ailment would often become dependent on it. The more they took, the more they needed to achieve the same effect, and if they tried to stop, they would suffer from withdrawal symptoms that were a special kind of hell: violent vomiting, stomach cramps, and a sense of all-consuming dread. The physicians, who were unaware of the concept of addiction, would often prescribe more opium to treat the withdrawal symptoms, creating a vicious cycle of dependence. The royal patient who had been given a cure for their pain had now been given a new and more insidious disease. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians of the time were aware of the addictive properties of opium. The answer is likely no. They saw the patient's craving for the drug not as a sign of addiction, but as a sign of their continued illness. They believed that the patient's body was still in a state of disharmony, and that the only way to restore the balance was to continue the treatment. This was a dangerous and often deadly ideology, and it was one that was applied with a particular fervour to the most powerful and therefore most valuable patients in the kingdom. The case of Queen Victoria is a fascinating example. She was a prolific user of laudanum, and she was prescribed it by her physicians for a variety of ailments, including menstrual cramps and the pains of childbirth. She would often take a dose of laudanum to help her sleep, and she relied on it for much of her life. She was, in a very real sense, an addict, but she was a royal addict, and her addiction was treated with a kind of medical solemnity that was unheard of for a commoner. She was a powerful and respected queen, but she was also a woman who was at the mercy of a drug that her doctors gave her without a second thought. The use of opium and laudanum in the royal courts shows us something profound about the nature of royal medicine. It was a world that was willing to embrace a powerful and often dangerous substance for its curative properties, but it was a world that was completely blind to the consequences of its use. The royal family, for all its wealth and power, was at the mercy of a medical system that was more interested in a quick fix than a long-term cure. The laudanum, in its own way, was a kind of a beautiful prison, a substance that promised freedom from pain, but delivered a new kind of bondage. You watch as the queen, now calm and serene, lies in her bed, her breathing slow and even. The physician, with a sense of professional satisfaction, puts the vial back in his bag. He has done his job. He has restored the queen's peace of mind, and he has, in his own way, saved her from herself. But you, with your knowledge of modern medicine, know that he has done something far more dangerous. He has given her a drug that will slowly but surely take away her freedom, her will, and her ability to live a life without pain. The royal bedchamber was not just a place of healing. It was a sanctuary of addiction, and the queen was just one more casualty in a long, brutal war against ignorance. And the next battle is about to begin, a battle fought with an oil that is more poisonous than any drug. The sweet, deceptive escape of opium has been left behind, and we are back in the brutal world of royal purging, but with a twist. This isn't just a daily enema or a mild laxative. This is a poison, a substance so potent and so dangerous that it's a testament to the sheer desperation of royal physicians. We're going to talk about croton oil, a substance derived from the seeds of a tropical plant, and its use as a powerful and often deadly purgative. You're about to witness a scene of such physical agony that it will make the king's daily enema seem like a walk in the park. For a royal with a stubborn illness, a physician's first thought was often to resort to the most violent solution, a solution that promised to clean the body of its toxins, but often ended up cleaning the life right out of it. Imagine you are a valet in the court of King Louis XV of France, a monarch known for his extravagant tastes and his delicate constitution. The king is suffering from a high fever, and his physicians, in their infinite wisdom, have determined that his body is filled with toxic humours that need to be expelled. They have tried bloodletting, cupping, and a host of other remedies, but nothing has worked. The lead physician, a man with a look of grim determination on his face, prepares a small glass vial. It contains a thick yellowish liquid with a sickly sweet smell. This is croton oil, and it is by far the most powerful and dangerous purgative of its time. The physician gives it to the king, and he drinks it down in a single gulp. This mainstream historical fact highlights a disturbing aspect of royal medicine, the belief that a powerful cure had to be a violent one. The physicians of the time saw the patient's suffering as a sign that the medicine was working. The more the king suffered, the more they believed that the poison was being driven from his body. The effects of croton oil were immediate and horrific. Within minutes of drinking the oil, the king would be overcome with a sense of intense nausea. His stomach would cramp, his bowels would rebel, and he would be racked with violent, uncontrollable bouts of vomiting and diarrhea. The vomiting would be so intense that it would leave him weak and dehydrated. The diarrhea would be so severe that it would leave his body drained of all its fluids. The king, a man of immense power, would be reduced to a miserable, pathetic wretch, his body a living testament to the destructive power of a medical belief system that was more about faith than science. A quirky tidbit is that the oil was so potent that a single drop was enough to cause a violent reaction. The physicians, however, would often prescribe a much larger dose, believing that the more violent the reaction, the more effective the cure. The king's body was a battlefield, and the croton oil was the ultimate weapon. It was a kind of scorched earth policy, a belief that if you couldn't defeat the enemy, you could at least burn down the entire battlefield and hope that the enemy was destroyed along with the rest of the landscape. The king's body was a landscape of pain, a landscape of vomiting, and a landscape of diarrhea. It was a living testament to the destructive power of a medical belief system that was more about faith than science. The use of croton oil for a king's ailment was a particularly powerful example of the do-something mentality of royal medicine. In an era where a disease was a terrifying unknown, a doctor who stood by and did nothing was seen as incompetent. A doctor who prescribed a powerful toxic substance and who could produce a tangible, if horrifying, result was seen as a man of action, a man to be trusted. The patient's suffering was a kind of proof, a sign that the medicine was working. It was a vicious cycle of belief and brutal physical reality. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians of the time were aware of the toxic effects of croton oil. The answer is likely yes, but they saw the side effects as an unfortunate but necessary part of the cure. They believed that the oil was so powerful that it was able to drive the disease from the body, and the patient's suffering was just a sign of the battle being waged. It was a kind of medical fatalism, a belief that a patient had to be made worse before they could get better. This was a dangerous and often deadly ideology, and it was one that was applied with a particular fervour to the most powerful and therefore most valuable patients in the kingdom. The case of King Louis XV is a tragic example. He was a man who was constantly ill, and he was subjected to a constant barrage of purges and bloodletting. The croton oil was just one more weapon in the physician's arsenal. He died a miserable and isolated man, his body a map of the brutal treatments he had endured. He was a king who ruled an empire, but in the end his body was not his own. It was a laboratory for the bizarre and brutal experiments of his physicians. The croton oil, in its own way, was a kind of final irony, a substance that was meant to cure him, but which only served to hasten his demise. The use of croton oil in the royal courts shows us something profound about the nature of the royal medicine. It was a world that was willing to embrace a powerful and often dangerous substance for its curative properties, but it was a world that was completely blind to the consequences of its use. The royal family, for all its wealth and power, was at the mercy of a medical system that was more interested in a quick fix than a long-term cure. The croton oil, in its own way, was a kind of a beautiful prison, a substance that promised freedom from disease, but delivered a new kind of bondage. You watch as the king, now a pale and skeletal figure, is led away from his commode. He is a shell of the man he once was, his once extravagant good looks replaced by the gaunt skeletal features of a man who is being slowly poisoned. His doctors, with a sense of grim satisfaction, note his progress in a ledger. They believe they are winning the war against the disease. You, with your knowledge of modern medicine, know that they are simply losing the battle for his life. The royal bedchamber was not a place of healing. It was a chamber of horrors, and the king was just one more casualty in a long, brutal war against ignorance. And the next battle is about to begin, a battle fought with a strange and surprising, and often uncomfortable weapon. The horrifying spectre of croton oil has faded, and we're now moving from a violent purging to a strangely gaseous one. This is perhaps one of the most bizarre and inexplicable medical treatments in the entire history of royal medicine. We're going to talk about tobacco smoke enemas, a practice so outlandish it sounds like a bad joke. But for centuries it was a legitimate and often highly praised treatment for a variety of ailments. The belief was that the smoke, with its warmth and its unique properties, could stimulate the body, revive the senses, and even bring a person back from the brink of death. You're about to witness a scene of such utter absurdity that it will make the king's daily enema seem positively normal. This isn't just a puff of smoke. This is a puff of smoke administered with a kind of medical solemnity that is almost unbelievable. Imagine you're standing on the banks of the Thames River and a royal dignitary has just been pulled from the water, a victim of a near drowning. He is cold, pale, and unresponsive. The royal physicians are summoned, and they don't bring a bottle of brandy or a warm blanket. They bring a strange, bellows-like device with a long, flexible tube and a small receptacle for tobacco. This is a tobacco smoke enema kit, and it is, by far, the most unusual tool in their medical arsenal. This mainstream historical fact is a testament to the sheer ingenuity and absurdity of royal medicine. The belief was that the tobacco smoke, which had been introduced to Europe from the Americas, had a kind of magical, life-giving property. The warmth of the smoke, it was thought, could restart the heart and lungs, and its stimulating properties could revive the patient's senses. The process itself was a spectacle. The physician would carefully place a small amount of tobacco in the receptacle and light it. He would then use the bellows to force the smoke through the tube and into the patient's rectum. The patient, who was often unconscious, would receive a dose of warm, acrid smoke that would, in the minds of the doctors, shock their system back to life. A quirky tidbit is that this was a surprisingly popular treatment. The Royal Humane Society, which was founded in 1774 to revive drowning victims, even placed these kits at various points along the Thames so that a person could be revived on the spot. It was a kind of a public service, a bizarre form of first aid that was based on a complete misunderstanding of the human body. The use of tobacco smoke enemas was not just limited to near-drowning victims. It was also used for a variety of other ailments. A royal patient with a cold might be given a dose of smoke to warm their body and to dry up the excess phlegm. A queen with a stomachache might be given one to relieve the pressure from her bowels. It was a one-size-fits-all solution, a universal panacea that was seen as a gentler alternative to the more violent purges we've already discussed. The smoke, in its own way, was a kind of a magical elixir, a substance that promised a cure but often delivered a new and more insidious problem. The physicians who prescribed this stuff were completely convinced of its efficacy. They believed that the smoke, with its unique properties, could enter the body and fix a wide range of problems. They saw the patient's reaction to the smoke, the coughing, the sputtering, the gagging, not as a sign of a problem, but as a sign that the treatment was working. The patient's body was a battlefield, and the tobacco smoke was the ultimate weapon. It was a kind of scorched earth policy, a belief that if you couldn't defeat the enemy, you could at least burn down the entire battlefield and hope that the enemy was destroyed along with the rest of the landscape. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians of the time were aware of the toxic effects of tobacco smoke. The answer is likely no. They saw the smoke not as a poison, but as a medicine. They believed that the smoke was so powerful that it was able to drive the disease from the body, and the patient's suffering was just a sign of the battle being waged. It was a kind of medical fatalism, a belief that a patient had to be made worse before they could get better. This was a dangerous and often deadly ideology, and it was one that was applied with a particular fervour to the most powerful and therefore most valuable patients in the kingdom. The use of tobacco smoke enemas eventually began to fade in the 19th century, as the dangers of smoking became more widely known and understood. But for centuries, it was a legitimate and often highly praised treatment. The royal family, with all its wealth and power, was at the mercy of a medical system that was more interested in a quick fix than a long-term cure. The tobacco smoke, in its own way, was a kind of a beautiful prison, a substance that promised a cure but delivered a new kind of bondage. You watch as the royal dignitary, now revived and coughing, is wrapped in a warm blanket. He's a shell of the man he once was, his once dashing good looks replaced by the gaunt, skeletal features of a man who has been revived by a bizarre and absurd medical treatment. His doctors, with a sense of grim satisfaction, note his progress in a ledger. They believe they are winning the war against the disease. You, with your knowledge of modern medicine, know that they are simply losing the battle for his life. The royal bedchamber was not a place of healing. It was a chamber of horrors, and the dignitary was just one more casualty in a long, brutal war against ignorance. And the next battle is about to begin, a battle fought with a strange and surprising and often uncomfortable weapon. The strange, smoky aftertaste of tobacco smoke enemas is finally clearing, and we're moving on to a treatment that is less about purging and more about preventing. We're going to talk about bezoar stones, a substance so rare and so highly valued that it was considered the ultimate antidote for any poison. The belief was that these stones, found in the digestive system of certain animals, had a magical, life-saving property. For a king who was constantly at risk of being poisoned by his rivals, the bezoar stone was a kind of a medical insurance policy, a small, precious talisman that promised to keep him safe from harm. You're about to see how a royal physician, in a desperate attempt to save his king, turned to a substance that was more myth than medicine. Imagine you're in the court of Queen Elizabeth I, a monarch who was constantly under threat of assassination and poisoning. The Queen has just collapsed, and her physicians, with a sense of frantic urgency, are trying to determine the cause. They suspect poison, a dark and insidious threat that was a constant source of fear in the royal courts. The lead physician, a man with a steady hand and a chillingly calm demeanour, pulls out a small, intricately carved box. Inside is a single, dark, smooth, and perfectly oval stone. This is a bezoar stone, and it is, by far, the most expensive and most highly prized medicine of its time. He grinds a small amount of the stone into a powder and mixes it with a glass of wine, which he then gives to the Queen. This mainstream historical fact highlights the deep-seated fear of poisoning in the royal courts, and the lengths to which physicians would go to find an antidote. The bezoar stone was believed to be a universal antidote, a substance that could counteract the effects of any poison. The origins of the belief in bezoar stones are a fascinating mix of ancient lore and twisted logic. The word bezoar comes from the Persian words padzar, which means antidote. The stones are, in fact, compact masses of undigested hair, plant fibres, and other materials that are found in the stomachs of animals, most commonly goats, sheep, and camels. They were believed to be formed by a kind of magical process, a process that gave them their life-saving properties. A quirky tidbit is that the value of a bezoar stone was so high that it was often more expensive than gold. A large, perfectly formed stone could be sold for a king's ransom. They were seen as a symbol of power and wealth, a kind of a royal status symbol. The Queen might not wear a crown of gold, but she might wear a bezoar stone on a necklace, a silent but powerful reminder of her protected status. The physicians who prescribed this stuff were completely convinced of its efficacy. They believed that the stone, with its unique properties, could absorb the poison and render it harmless. They would often test the stone's authenticity by placing it in a glass of poisoned water. If the water was rendered harmless, the stone was considered to be genuine. Of course, this was a kind of a trick, a kind of a magic trick that had more to do with the chemistry of the poison than the magic of the stone. But to the royal court it was a powerful and convincing demonstration. The bezoar stone was a kind of a medical miracle, a substance that promised a cure, but often delivered nothing but a false sense of security. The use of bezoar stones was not just limited to poisoning, it was also used for a variety of other ailments. A royal patient with a fever might be given a dose of powdered stone to purify their body. A queen with a stomachache might be given one to relieve the pressure from her bowels. It was a one-size-fits-all solution, a universal panacea that was seen as a gentler alternative to the more violent purges we've already discussed. The stone, in its own way, was a kind of a magical elixir, a substance that promised a cure, but often delivered a new and more insidious problem. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians of the time were aware of the placebo effect of bezoar stones. The answer is likely yes, but they saw the placebo effect not as a trick, but as a part of the cure. They believed that the patient's belief in the stone was just as important as the stone itself. They saw the patient's craving for the stone not as a sign of addiction, but as a sign of their continued illness. They believed that the patient's body was still in a state of disharmony, and that the only way to restore the balance was to continue the treatment. This was a dangerous and often deadly ideology, and it was one that was applied with a particular fervour to the most powerful and therefore most valuable patients in the kingdom. The case of Queen Elizabeth I is a fascinating example. She was a prolific user of bezoar stones, and she was prescribed them by her physicians for a variety of ailments. She was a powerful and respected queen, but she was also a woman who was at the mercy of a medical system that was more interested in a quick fix than a long-term cure. The bezoar stone, in its own way, was a kind of a beautiful prison, a substance that promised freedom from disease, but delivered a new kind of bondage. The use of bezoar stones in the royal courts shows us something profound about the nature of royal medicine. It was a world that was willing to embrace a powerful and often dangerous substance for its curative properties, but it was a world that was completely blind to the consequences of its use. The royal family, for all its wealth and power, was at the mercy of a medical system that was more interested in a quick fix than a long-term cure. The bezoar stone, in its own way, was a kind of a beautiful prison, a substance that promised a cure but delivered a new kind of bondage. You watch as the queen, now calm and serene, lies in her bed, her breathing slow and even. The physician, with a sense of professional satisfaction, puts the vial back in his bag. He has done his job. He has restored the queen's peace of mind, and he has, in his own way, saved her from herself. But you, with your knowledge of modern medicine, know that he has done something far more dangerous. He has given her a drug that will slowly but surely take away her freedom, her will, and her ability to live a life without pain. The royal bedchamber was not just a place of healing. It was a sanctuary of addiction, and the queen was just one more casualty in a long, brutal war against ignorance, and the next battle is about to begin, a battle fought with a strange and surprising and often uncomfortable weapon. The bezoar stone has offered its false promise of protection, and we are now moving into a realm where the medicine is not just rare but mythical. We're going to talk about unicorn horn, a substance so rare and so highly valued that it was considered the ultimate cure for any illness and a sure antidote for any poison. The belief was that the horn, which was believed to come from the legendary unicorn, had a magical, life-giving property. For a king who was constantly in search of a cure for his illnesses, the unicorn horn was a kind of a medical holy grail, a small, precious talisman that promised to keep him safe from harm. You're about to see how a royal physician, in a desperate attempt to save his king, turned to a substance that was more fantasy than medicine. Imagine you're in the royal treasury, a room filled with gold, jewels, and other priceless treasures, but your eyes are drawn to a single, long, spiralling tusk, a creamy white colour with a faint, otherworldly sheen. This is a unicorn horn, and it is by far the most expensive and most highly prized medicine of its time. The royal physician, with a sense of reverence in his voice, explains its provenance. He tells the king that it comes from the legendary unicorn, a creature so pure and so magical that its horn has the power to cure any illness and to neutralize any poison. He grinds a small amount of the horn into a powder and mixes it with a glass of wine, which he then gives to the king. This mainstream historical fact highlights the deep-seated belief in mythical creatures and the lengths to which physicians would go to find a cure. The unicorn horn was believed to be a universal antidote, a substance that could counteract the effects of any poison. The origins of the belief in unicorn horn are a fascinating mix of ancient lore and mistaken identity. The unicorn horn was in fact the tusk of a narwhal, a small whale that lives in the Arctic. The narwhal's tusk, which can grow up to 10 feet long, is a single, spiralling tooth that protrudes from its head. The Vikings and other northern peoples would often find these tusks and sell them to European merchants, who in turn would sell them as unicorn horns. The demand for the horns was so high that a black market for them emerged. The merchants would often pass off walrus tusks or other ivory as unicorn horns, and the buyers, who had no way of knowing the difference, would pay a fortune for them. A quirky tidbit is that the value of a unicorn horn was so high that it was often more expensive than gold. A large, perfectly formed horn could be sold for a king's ransom. They were seen as a symbol of power and wealth, a kind of a royal status symbol. The king might not wear a crown of gold, but he might have a unicorn horn in his treasury, a silent but powerful reminder of his protected status. The physicians who prescribed this stuff were completely convinced of its efficacy. They believed that the horn, with its unique properties, could absorb the poison and render it harmless. They would often test the horn's authenticity by placing it in a glass of poisoned water. If the water was rendered harmless, the horn was considered to be genuine. Of course, this was a kind of a trick, a kind of a magic trick, that had more to do with the chemistry of the poison than the magic of the horn. But to the royal court it was a powerful and convincing demonstration. The unicorn horn was a kind of a medical miracle, a substance that promised a cure but often delivered nothing but a false sense of security. The use of unicorn horn was not just limited to poisoning, it was also used for a variety of other ailments. A royal patient with a fever might be given a dose of powdered horn to purify their body. A queen with a stomachache might be given one to relieve the pressure from her bowels. It was a one-size-fits-all solution, a universal panacea that was seen as a gentler alternative to the more violent purges we've already discussed. The horn, in its own way, was a kind of a magical elixir, a substance that promised a cure, but often delivered a new and more insidious problem. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians of the time were aware of the placebo effect of unicorn horns. The answer is likely yes, but they saw the placebo effect not as a trick, but as a part of the cure. They believed that the patient's belief in the horn was just as important as the horn itself. They saw the patient's craving for the horn not as a sign of addiction, but as a sign of their continued illness. They believed that the patient's body was still in a state of disharmony, and that the only way to restore the balance was to continue the treatment. This was a dangerous and often deadly ideology, and it was one that was applied with a particular fervour to the most powerful and therefore most valuable patients in the kingdom. The case of Queen Elizabeth I is a fascinating example. She was a prolific user of unicorn horns, and she was prescribed them by her physicians for a variety of ailments. She was a powerful and respected queen, but she was also a woman who was at the mercy of a medical system that was more interested in a quick fix than a long-term cure. The unicorn horn, in its own way, was a kind of a beautiful prison, a substance that promised freedom from disease, but delivered a new kind of bondage. The use of unicorn horns in the royal court shows us something profound about the nature of royal medicine. It was a world that was willing to embrace a powerful and often dangerous substance for its curative properties, but it was a world that was completely blind to the consequences of its use. The royal family, for all its wealth and power, was at the mercy of a medical system that was more interested in a quick fix than a long-term cure. The unicorn horn, in its own way, was a kind of a beautiful prison, a substance that promised a cure but delivered a new kind of bondage. You watch as the king, now calm and serene, lies in his bed, his breathing slow and even. The physician, with a sense of professional satisfaction, puts the vial back in his bag. He has done his job. He has restored the king's peace of mind, and he has, in his own way, saved him from himself. But you, with your knowledge of modern medicine, know that he has done something far more dangerous. He has given him a drug that will slowly but surely take away his freedom, his will, and his ability to live a life without pain. The royal bedchamber was not just a place of healing, it was a sanctuary of addiction, and the king was just one more casualty in a long, brutal war against ignorance. And the next battle is about to begin, a battle fought with a strange and surprising and often uncomfortable weapon. The phantom unicorn horn has vanished, leaving us with the familiar feeling of medical absurdity. But now we're going to move from the realm of the mythical to the deeply personal, and a little bit gross. We're going to talk about uroscopy, the practice of diagnosing illness by examining a person's urine. This wasn't a fringe practice. For centuries, a royal physician's first and most important tool was not a scalpel or a syringe, but a glass flask filled with a king's or queen's freshly voided urine. The belief was that the urine, as a kind of filtered essence of the body, held the key to a person's health, and that a skilled physician could read the urine like a book. You're about to see how a simple bodily function became a central part of a royal doctor's daily ritual, and how a urine sample could determine a monarch's fate. Imagine you are a valet in the court of King Henry VIII, a monarch known for his immense appetites and his equally immense health problems. Every morning a chamber pot containing the king's urine is collected with a kind of ritualistic solemnity. It is then delivered to the royal physician's private laboratory, where it is transferred to a special clear glass flask called a matula. This mainstream historical fact highlights the central role of uroscopy in royal medicine. The physician would hold the flask up to the light, swirling the contents and examining it for a host of different signs. The colour, the clarity, the sediment, the smell, everything was a clue, a sign of the king's internal state. A pale, clear urine might indicate a cold humour, while a dark, cloudy urine might indicate a surfeit of black bile. The physician would meticulously record his observations in a ledger, and his diagnosis would be based entirely on what he saw, smelled and felt. The logic behind this was simple, and, by the standards of the time, quite sound. The urine was seen as a kind of a medical mirror, a reflection of the body's internal workings. A sick body, it was believed, would produce a sick urine, and a sick urine in turn could tell the physician exactly what was wrong. A quirky tidbit is that the physician would often use a special chart called a uroscopy wheel to help him with his diagnosis. The wheel was a circular chart with different colours and descriptions of urine, and it would help the physician determine the nature of the disease. The physician would spin the wheel, and based on the colour of the king's urine, he would be able to diagnose a fever, a stomach ailment, or even a mental illness. It was a kind of a medical lottery, a game of chance that was played with the king's life. The physicians who prescribed this stuff were completely convinced of its efficacy. They believed that the urine, with its unique properties, could enter the body and fix a wide range of problems. They saw the patient's reaction to the smoke, the coughing, the sputtering, the gagging, not as a sign of a problem, but as a sign that the treatment was working. The patient's body was a battlefield, and the tobacco smoke was the ultimate weapon. It was a kind of scorched earth policy, a belief that if you couldn't defeat the enemy, you could at least burn down the entire battlefield and hope that the enemy was destroyed along with the rest of the landscape. The use of uroscopy was not just limited to the royal court. It was a widespread practice throughout Europe, and it was embraced by royals and commoners alike. But the royal court under King Henry VIII was where it reached its zenith. The king, who saw himself as a symbol of divine perfection, believed that his body had to be a perfect vessel, and the uroscopy was the tool that made that possible. The king's body, in a very real sense, was a metaphor for his kingdom. A healthy body meant a healthy kingdom, and an unhealthy body meant a kingdom in decline. The uroscopy, therefore, was not just a medical treatment, it was a political act. It was a way for the king to show his subjects that he was in control, that his body was a well-oiled machine, and that his kingdom was strong and prosperous. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians of the time were aware of the placebo effect of uroscopy. The answer is likely yes, but they saw the placebo effect not as a trick, but as a part of the cure. They believed that the patient's belief in the urine was just as important as the urine itself. They saw the patient's craving for the urine not as a sign of addiction, but as a sign of their continued illness. They believed that the patient's body was still in a state of disharmony, and that the only way to restore the balance was to continue the treatment. This was a dangerous and often deadly ideology, and it was one that was applied with a particular fervour to the most powerful and therefore most valuable patients in the kingdom. The case of King Henry VIII is a fascinating example. He was a man who was constantly ill, and he was subjected to a constant barrage of purges and bloodletting. The uroscopy was just one more weapon in the physician's arsenal. He died a miserable and isolated man, his body a map of the brutal treatments he had endured. He was a king who ruled an empire, but in the end, his body was not his own. It was a laboratory for the bizarre and brutal experiments of his physicians. The uroscopy, in its own way, was a kind of a final irony, a substance that was meant to cure him, but which only served to hasten his demise. The use of uroscopy in the royal court shows us something profound about the nature of royal medicine. It was a world that was willing to embrace a powerful and often dangerous substance for its curative properties, but it was a world that was completely blind to the consequences of its use. The royal family, for all its wealth and power, was at the mercy of a medical system that was more interested in a quick fix than a long-term cure. The uroscopy, in its own way, was a kind of a beautiful prison, a substance that promised a cure, but delivered a new kind of bondage. You watch as the king, now a pale and skeletal figure, is led away from his commode. He is a shell of the man he once was, his once extravagant good looks replaced by the gaunt, skeletal features of a man who is being slowly poisoned. His doctors, with a sense of grim satisfaction, note his progress in a ledger. They believe they are winning the war against the disease. You, with your knowledge of modern medicine, know that they are simply losing the battle for his life. The royal bedchamber was not a place of healing. It was a chamber of horrors, and the king was just one more casualty in a long, brutal war against ignorance. And the next battle is about to begin, a battle fought with a strange and surprising, and often uncomfortable weapon. The strange world of uroscopy, with its ritualistic examination of a king's urine, has shown us that royal physicians were not afraid to get intimate with their patients. But now, we are going to move from a substance that was a part of the living body to a substance that was a part of the dead one. We're going to talk about powdered human skull, a macabre and deeply unsettling remedy that was believed to be a powerful cure for a variety of ailments, most notably epilepsy and other neurological disorders. The belief was that the human skull, as the container of the mind, held a kind of magical curative power. For a royal with a mental or neurological illness, this was not a last resort. It was a serious and often prescribed course of action. You're about to witness a scene of such utter desperation and cruelty that it will make the king's daily enema seem positively normal. De Google Cap Veep. Imagine you are in the bedchamber of a young prince who is suffering from a violent epileptic fit. He is thrashing on the bed, his body racked with convulsions, and his mouth is a frothy white. The royal physicians have tried everything: bloodletting, purges, and even a dose of a powerful opium concoction. Nothing has worked. The lead physician, a man with a look of grim determination on his face, pulls out a small dark jar. It contains a fine, greyish powder with a faint metallic smell. This is powdered human skull, and it is by far the most unsettling and most highly prized medicine of its time. He mixes a small amount of the powder with a glass of wine and gives it to the prince. This mainstream historical fact is a testament to the sheer desperation and lack of medical knowledge of the time. The belief was that the human skull, as the container of the mind, held a kind of magical, curative power. The physicians of the time saw the patient's suffering as a sign that the medicine was working. The more the prince suffered, the more they believed that the poison was being driven from his body. The origins of the belief in powdered human skull are a fascinating mix of ancient lore and twisted logic. The practice, known as mumiacranie or skull mummy, was a part of the larger medical tradition of consuming human remains. But the skull, as the container of the brain, was believed to be particularly powerful. It was believed to contain a kind of life-giving essence, a kind of magical curative power that could cure any illness. A quirky tidbit is that the source of the skulls was often a subject of great debate. Some physicians believed that the skulls had to come from a young healthy man who had died a violent death. Others believed that the skulls had to come from a person who had died a natural death. The most highly prized skulls were those from Egyptian mummies, which were believed to contain a kind of ancient life-giving power. The demand for the skulls was so high that a black market for them emerged. Grave robbers and charlatans would sell skulls from recently deceased criminals and tramps, which were then treated to resemble authentic skulls from a mummy. This led to a strange problem for royal apothecaries: how to tell a real skull from a fake. The solution was often to look for the authenticating signs of age, like the presence of bits of hair or the smell of ancient spices. The physicians who prescribed this stuff were completely convinced of its efficacy. They believed that the skull, with its unique properties, could enter the body and fix a wide range of problems. They saw the patient's reaction to the powder, the violent convulsions, the delirium, the vomiting, not as a sign of a problem, but as a sign that the treatment was working. The patient's body was a battlefield, and the powdered skull was the ultimate weapon. It was a kind of scorched earth policy, a belief that if you couldn't defeat the enemy, you could at least burn down the entire battlefield, and hope that the enemy was destroyed along with the rest of the landscape. The prince's body was a landscape of pain, a landscape of vomiting, and a landscape of diarrhea. It was a living testament to the destructive power of a medical belief system that was more about faith than science. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians of the time were aware of the toxic effects of powdered human skull. The answer is likely yes, but they saw the side effects as an unfortunate but necessary part of the cure. They believed that the skull was so powerful that it was able to drive the disease from the body, and the patient's suffering was just a sign of the battle being waged. It was a kind of medical fatalism, a belief that a patient had to be made worse before they could get better. This was a dangerous and often deadly ideology, and it was one that was applied with a particular fervour to the most powerful and therefore most valuable patients in the kingdom. The case of King Charles II of England is a fascinating example. As his life was ebbing away in 1685, he was subjected to a truly horrifying barrage of treatments. His physicians, in their desperation, tried everything, including a dose of powdered human skull. The hope was that the powder would have a kind of magical life-giving property that would bring him back from the brink of death. It didn't work. He died a miserable and isolated man, his body a map of the brutal treatments he had endured. He was a king who ruled an empire, but in the end his body was not his own. It was a laboratory for the bizarre and brutal experiments of his physicians. The powdered human skull, in its own way, was a kind of a final irony, a substance that was meant to cure him, but which only served to hasten his demise. The use of powdered human skull in the royal courts shows us something profound about the nature of royal medicine. It was a world that was willing to embrace a powerful and often dangerous substance for its curative properties, but it was a world that was completely blind to the consequences of its use. The royal family, for all its wealth and power, was at the mercy of a medical system that was more interested in a quick fix than a long-term cure. The powdered human skull, in its own way, was a kind of a beautiful prison, a substance that promised a cure but delivered a new kind of bondage. You watch as the prince, now calm and serene, lies in his bed, his breathing slow and even. The physician, with a sense of professional satisfaction, puts the vial back in his bag. He has done his job. He has restored the prince's peace of mind, and he has, in his own way, saved him from himself. But you, with your knowledge of modern medicine, know that he has done something far more dangerous. He has given him a drug that will slowly but surely take away his freedom, his will, and his ability to live a life without pain. The royal bedchamber was not just a place of healing, it was a chamber of horrors, and the prince was just one more casualty in a long, brutal war against ignorance. And the next battle is about to begin, a battle fought with a strange and surprising and often uncomfortable weapon. The grisly spectre of powdered human skull is a hard one to leave behind, but we have reached the final chapter of our journey into the bizarre world of royal medicine. We are now going to talk about smallpox, a disease that was a constant and terrifying threat to the royal family, and how a new and highly controversial treatment, inoculation, began to change the face of medicine forever. This wasn't a strange magical cure or a toxic purge. This was a proto-scientific procedure that promised to protect a monarch from a disease that had been a silent killer for centuries. You're about to witness the dawn of a new era in medicine, an era that would slowly but surely begin to replace superstition with science. Imagine you are in the court of Queen Caroline, the wife of King George II. The year is 1721, and a new and terrifying disease has swept through Europe. Smallpox, a disease that caused a high fever, a terrible rash, and a host of other debilitating symptoms, was a constant threat. It could disfigure a person for life, or it could kill them in a matter of days. For a royal, whose very legitimacy depended on their physical appearance, a pockmarked face was a personal and political disaster. The royal physicians, with a sense of grim determination on their faces, are discussing a new and highly controversial procedure that has just arrived in England from the Ottoman Empire. It is called variolation, or inoculation, and it promises to protect the royal family from the pox. This mainstream historical fact highlights the fear of smallpox and the desperation of royal physicians to find a cure. The belief was that by introducing a small amount of the smallpox virus into a healthy person, you could give them a mild case of the disease, and they would then be immune for life. The origins of the practice are a fascinating mix of ancient lore and twisted logic. In the Ottoman Empire, it was a common practice for mothers to inoculate their children by scratching a small amount of pus from a smallpox victim into their skin. The child would then get a mild case of the disease, and they would be immune for life. This was, in essence, a kind of a primitive vaccine. But in England, the idea was met with a great deal of scepticism and fear. The physicians, who were still steeped in the humoral theory of medicine, saw it as a kind of a magical and dangerous practice. A quirky tidbit is that the practice was brought to England by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey. She had witnessed the practice firsthand, and she was so convinced of its efficacy that she had her own son inoculated. She then wrote a series of letters to her friends in England, describing the practice and its benefits. She was, in a very real sense, the first medical missionary, a woman who brought a new and revolutionary idea to her country. The physicians who prescribed this stuff were completely convinced of its efficacy. They believed that the pus, with its unique properties, could enter the body and fix a wide range of problems. They saw the patient's reaction to the pus, the mild fever, the apathetic mood, the rash, not as a sign of a problem, but as a sign that the treatment was working. The patient's body was a battlefield, and the pus was the ultimate weapon. It was a kind of scorched earth policy, a belief that if you couldn't defeat the enemy, you could at least burn down the entire battlefield and hope that the enemy was destroyed along with the rest of the landscape. The prince's body was a landscape of pain, a landscape of vomiting, and a landscape of diarrhea. It was a living testament to the destructive power of a medical belief system that was more about faith than science. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians of the time were aware of the placebo effect of inoculation. The answer is likely yes, but they saw the placebo effect not as a trick but as a part of the cure. They believed that the patient's belief in the pus was just as important as the pus itself. They saw the patient's craving for the pus not as a sign of addiction, but as a sign of their continued illness. They believed that the patient's body was still in a state of disharmony, and that the only way to restore the balance was to continue the treatment. This was a dangerous and often deadly ideology, and it was one that was applied with a particular fervour to the most powerful and therefore most valuable patients in the kingdom. The case of the royal family is a fascinating example. Queen Caroline was so convinced of the practice that she had her own daughters inoculated. The procedure was a success, and the princesses recovered with a mild case of the disease. The news of the success of the royal inoculation spread throughout Europe, and the practice, which had been met with so much scepticism and fear, began to gain a foothold in the medical community. The royal family, in a very real sense, had become a living laboratory for a new and revolutionary idea. Their courage and their willingness to embrace a new idea, even if it was met with so much opposition, had a profound impact on the history of medicine. The use of inoculation in the royal courts shows us something profound about the nature of royal medicine. It was a world that was willing to embrace a powerful and often dangerous substance for its curative properties, but it was a world that was completely blind to the consequences of its use. The royal family, for all its wealth and power, was at the mercy of a medical system that was more interested in a quick fix than a long-term cure. The inoculation, in its own way, was a kind of a beautiful prison, a substance that promised a cure but delivered a new kind of bondage. You watch as the princess, now a pale and skeletal figure, is led away from her commode. He is a shell of the man he once was, his once extravagant good looks replaced by the gaunt skeletal features of a man who is being slowly poisoned. His doctors, with a sense of grim satisfaction, note his progress in a ledger. They believe they are winning the war against the disease. You, with your knowledge of modern medicine, know that they are simply losing the battle for his life. The royal bedchamber was not just a place of healing. It was a chamber of horrors, and the princess was just one more casualty in a long, brutal war against ignorance. And the next battle is about to begin, a battle fought with a strange and surprising and often uncomfortable weapon.